Hello and welcome, everybody. It's a pity we couldn't meet in person, but at this time we preferred to have a wide reach and a diverse audience by inviting you to join this webinar. Today's focus is on the intersection of a handful of large global problematics. We have climate change, making the Arctic more accessible, but also, of course, spurring a need for a green transition and a need for a lot of minerals in that regard. We have the general rise of China, where there's a general, increasingly strained combination of roles in global economy and world politics. And middle of those two processes, at least from a Danish perspective, we have Greenland's slow motion decolonization, in which the next steps imagined by Greenlanders almost always involve some kind of minerals extraction. Out there's a lot of alarming scenarios that's been drawn up on this intersection of problems. But the main task today will be to provide some facts on the ground, which my colleagues have dug out in different research projects. So the ambition here is not to redraw the whole map today, but to dig into some core mechanisms, maybe making it possible for us to recalibrate our thoughts on how these problematics of mineral supplies, climate change, and Greenlandic and Arctic development intersect. So I'm really glad that I have with me here today Yang Jiang, who's a senior researcher at Danish Institute for International Studies, Patrick Anderson, who's a researcher at the same institution, but was until recently a PhD student at the Greenland and Denmark Geological Survey, GEUS, and Aalborg. And then, last but not least, we have Per Kalvig, who's a senior analyst also at GEUS. He might be retiring, but it seems like he's never tiring. So we're really happy to have him with us. As you see in a second, when I manage to share my screen, if I can find out, yeah, here it is, I think. Please tell me that this is the right one. Does this have an agenda? We will first, Pierre will talk to us about the inadequate supply chains in the West as a main reason for bottlenecks in the mineral sector. Then Patrick will present joint work by Pierre and Patrick on really kind of what is the Chinese involvement in the Arctic mineral sector. And then Yang Jiang will zoom in on basically the same problematic, but in Greenland, before Patrick ends on telling us about how the way these minerals projects are framed in Chinese political discourse and in Western discourse may sometimes end up in less than symbiotic ways. I hope very much that you will put questions already now. If you look to the bottom of your Zoom screen, there should be a Q&A box. We won't have oral interaction in this seminar, but as my colleagues are writing in the chat, please put the questions in the Q&A feature, and then I will relay them to the presenters. Please put them already while you're inspired, while they talk. We might squeeze in one or two down the line, otherwise we'll have a solid Q&A session in the end. We'll end hopefully at 3:30 this time. And I should add just one thing. One reason why I'm so happy for this lineup is that it allows us to draw not just on the research done for the couple of these publications that were listed in the invitation, but actually what Patrick and Pierre particularly is going to present really builds on years of research. So in a moment in the chat, you will find links to a report Pierre did on rare earth elements, supply chains, and to Patrick's PhD on the categories and prioritizations in Chinese foreign policy and minerals policies. So there's solid research behind this seminar, and there will be even more quite soon. We'll publish a working paper documenting some of the claims that will also come here in this seminar. Really happy to see you. I leave the floor to Pierre with this.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ulrik, and welcome everyone. Yes, today I will talk about the inadequate supply chains in listing some of the reasons for these bottlenecks and the concerns. And if this will work, a second, hopefully it will. Oh, here we are. I think it worked. Thank you. And first of all, the mineral raw materials, that's all the materials which we can't grow. So we have to mine it and to process the minerals from the mine prior to any industrial use. But they are vital to our society, and we use it for construction, for all buildings and infrastructure, for communication, for energy transport, for energy production, for communication, for pharmaceuticals and farming, etc., etc. So it's very much a vital thing for all societies. There's something wrong here. That, I apologize for that. Yeah, sorry. And then some of the drivers, that's very much the growing population and growing GDP. So there's enormous pressure on the production of raw materials. So we can see that on the right figure that the demand has doubled in the past 20 years. And that's really a challenge for the mining and mineral sector and for the attached processing industries as well. If we look at the mineral raw material supply chain, this cartoon somehow shows the major elements that we have. The upper part of the chain, mineral exploration, and which eventually, after long and many attempts, lead to mining. And then downstream, we have the processing complex net of industries, processing and melting, alloying, and making semi-products for the industry, which can be manufactured and eventually be used in the society. And the upper end is, of course, located very much depending on the geology and where opportunities are for mining. And it's characterized also with a fairly low employment rate, and technology is not that advanced. Of course, advanced in the mining, but it's relatively simple, as opposed to the downstream part, the processing and melting and alloying and making all the semi-products for the industry, which is composed of a very complex net of industries specialized in these what they do. And so it's also characterized by high employment, many people involved, and IP rights and high technology. It's much more complex set compared to the mining. And in the downstream part, and in the mining, the whole supply chain, it's based on, for all the units involved in this chain, that each of them have an attractive business model. If that is not the case, it will simply not work. We have a little bit of additional supply recycling, but it's not very much. And I will not say touch on that in this presentation more than that. Another thing is that of interest here is that we can see that in the West, in US and in Europe, we have outsourced mining for many, many years, and it has somehow been taken over by Asia and South America, Canada, and China, of course, and USSR. And not only mining has been outsourced, but the related industries, processing, the minerals, have been outsourced as well. So we are lacking that very much in the West. And here we have to consider that value chains, they're numerous. There's not just one. There are plenty for each commodity. There are several value chains or supply chains, and they become more and more visual as we come down in the chain. And so this is really a challenge to keep the production up to fit into the demand. And sometimes it actually doesn't work really. So we see that, for instance, the Chinese monopoly and the industries in Europe means that the processing facilities or the infrastructure for processing is inadequate. And that's really a big problem. And it's even a bigger problem now when we also have to fit into to supply the new minerals like rare earths, lithium, manganese, graphite, cobalt, and there are plenty. And the processing, the infrastructure for processing green minerals is even more complicated and complex, which are not available in but China has established very strong and now for the green mineral production, we can see that we also are behind because it takes about not less than 10 years to complete mineral exploration to new mining sites. And it means that the green transition is going so fast for the mining industry to cope with that demand. And it means that the constraint, it used to be downstream, but now it may really a challenge, and that's maybe where the Arctic may come in. If we look at China, as I mentioned, China has developed a very strong industry. So the downstream and the market for downstream products is very, very strong. China has set up, say, a system, tax regime, and strategies which, say, secures that they really control the downstream part. So no export of semi-products. All try, they really try to export high value products. Okay. Yeah, yeah. Can you hear me? Yep, yep. Thank you very much. Sorry for that. So, so that's where China is. And, it also means that China has a major share of the global consumption. So for the 7 commodities here, which are some of the basic industrial commodities, China is, say, taking about or using about half of the global production. So it's enormous. And now we can see, for instance, this figure, global, and that it's fast growing, and China is the very much the far the biggest producer, but it's not the biggest producer as in iron ore. So it means that a lot of the iron is actually imported, and that's why China has organized, say, they are involved in the mining industry, in particularly in Australia, but also in Brazil, from where the majority of the iron ore stems. If we look at some of the other commodities, copper, nickel, cobalt, rare earths, and lithium, we look at the copper, this figure, the mining sector shows the most dominant countries. China is much dominant everywhere. And they actually are not ranked as number 3. China has no raw material supply. That's what we think we see in some Canada. In the environment in the Arctic, agreement or contract. Sure. In the industry. But now I'm actually.
So unfortunately, I understand that there are troubles with the sound, but I think I managed to finish anyhow, and it's the message here is that China is say on the road to secure their downstream industries with raw materials from overseas. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I think we did lose a bit of your sound sometimes, but I think the main message got through that you have to have a diversified picture of the different, first of all, different stages in those value chains. It's not always the bulk that's the limiting part, but also that you actually do have to make this analysis for each commodity. And therefore the Arctic plays different roles in these different supply chains. I hand over the floor now to Patrick to present what Per's overall image of these supply chains means for the mining projects and mining minerals extraction in the Arctic. What's happening on the ground there? Thank you.
Yes, hello. Can you hear me well? Great, I will share my screen here.
Patrick, you did pick the,
Does it look right now?
Now it does.
Perfect. Okay, yes, hello everyone. So my name is Patrick Andersson and I'm a researcher here at DIIS. And I will present a working paper that I'm writing with Pierre Calvi, as Ulrik mentioned. And in the paper, we're studying Chinese involvement in the Arctic mineral sector. So Pierre has already told you the basics of how the raw material supply chain works and about China's dominant role in them. And China has achieved this dominance not by accident. And while the reasons are very complex, of course, government planning has definitely played a part. The Chinese government has a long-term strategy for securing mineral raw materials to its downstream sectors. And in this presentation, we will look at how this strategy plays out in the Arctic and how it affects the Arctic mineral sector. But first, a bit of background. So there's been a lot of talk about China locking up resources globally. And the media sometimes portrays China as this well-oiled state machine, a China Inc., that moves into different regions of the world and locks up resources. And there are many reasons for these perceptions. China is after all a one-party state run by a communist party. And while China is not a command economy anymore, today China is a kind of hybrid economy, right? But the government has continued to issue all kinds of strategic 5-year plans, and not just for the economy as a whole. So there are 5-year plans for different sectors of the economy and even for specific commodities or commodity groups. And on the foreign policy side, the Arctic has become part of several major projects. So the Belt and Road project has added an Arctic Silk Road. And China also has an explicit goal of becoming a polar great power, which is part of the overarching goal of becoming a maritime great power. And Arctic resource extraction is an important component of that goal. So people, they often tend to look at Chinese investments in Arctic mining as part of a strategy or long-term plan to control Arctic resources. And some Chinese investments in the Arctic, especially in Greenland, have been very controversial, which I think we will talk about in some of the later presentations. So, but what are actually the facts on the ground? So we found that there are still a lot of unanswered questions about the scope of Chinese activities in the Arctic mineral sector. So, for example, how much control do Chinese companies have over mineral flows from the Arctic? And what strategies do they use when they engage in projects? For example, do they acquire projects, or do they acquire and actually own projects, or do they prefer to join as partners? And finally, to what extent do their investments actually serve China's mineral strategy? Do they target those minerals that the Chinese state has decided are strategic for China's long-term development? So can we find any patterns here, or do their decisions look a lot more random and unrelated to government strategy? So what are some of the dynamics involved here? And in the paper, we studied Chinese control over mineral flows from 6 Arctic countries or territories. So Canada, Greenland, Norway, Finland, Sweden, and Alaska in the US. And some previous studies on Chinese control over global mineral flows, they have focused on ownership of mines. And they tend to conclude that Chinese control over global mine production is relatively small. but we wanted to move beyond ownership of mines as a measurement for control. So we argue that mine ownership has little relevance for what and for whom a mine produces, and is even less relevant for measuring control over downstream processing and manufacturing. Because the minerals that are extracted at the mine, they still, of course, as Pierre mentioned, they still have to be processed into the advanced materials and products that are actually what's in demand by the manufacturing industry downstream. And mine ownership in itself, it means little for where the minerals actually go to be processed. So instead, our approach was to look at 13 different parameters for control, and ownership was just one of these. So I won't bore you with specific details about the methodology, and there's also no time for that. But our parameters included, for example, control via offtake agreements. So an offtake agreement is basically an agreement that you buy what the mine produces. And some projects cannot go ahead if there's not a takeoff agreement in place beforehand. And a takeoff agreement basically gives control over the raw materials that are extracted from the mine. And then another parameter was control via shareholding or board membership in the mine owner, and control that comes by providing funding or technological assistance, for example. So then we awarded different points for all of these 13 parameters, and we then went through the projects where we had identified Chinese involvement and ticked off the boxes for the different parameters, so that we got a kind of control score, as we call it, for each project. So compared to the mine ownership approach, we basically begin one step further upstream at mineral exploration. Exploration is the first step in the mineral supply chain, and controlling the major exploration projects of the world is the first step towards controlling the mineral supply of the future. And we also take one step further downstream by taking into control via, for example, offtake arrangement, as I mentioned, and technological assistance. So what did we find? So I will share with you some preliminary observations that we have made, and but it's still a work in progress. First, we found Chinese involvement in a total of 40 projects. So that means that for 40 projects, we found Chinese involvement on at least one of the parameters. And this is a very small share of Arctic projects overall. And we also found that the projects are very concentrated in Canada. So this raises the question as to why Chinese companies prefer Canada over the other Arctic countries. Is it because of the license system or the geological conditions on the ground, or does Canada attract Chinese companies with favorable investment policies? So I guess it could be a combination of these different factors. And then second, we also found that activities are mostly focused on mineral exploration. And this is not so surprising because there are many more exploration licenses than there are mining licenses. And China was also a relative latecomer to the Arctic mineral sector. So some of the most attractive mines may have already been controlled by Western companies. Third, we found that no single Chinese company dominates. Chinese investments are not monopolized by one or a few major companies. We found a total of 33 medium or large-sized Chinese companies involved in the 40 projects. And again, these are preliminary numbers. And these companies included China's major SOEs and global players like China Minmetals, Baowu Steel, China Nonferrous, and Wisco, but also public companies with strong state links like CATL, which is now the world's largest battery manufacturer. And we did not find any small, like really small scale miners to be active in the Arctic. And fourth, we found that it's more common for Chinese companies to join projects as partners than to own projects. And finally, we found that Chinese companies or Chinese investments, they cover a very wide range of commodities. So today there's so much focus on the critical minerals, or the green minerals like rare earths and lithium, graphite, that it's easy to forget about the other stuff. And the Chinese projects, they covered steel metals, base metals, battery metals, uranium, gold, and specialty metals like rare earths. And control also varies across the different commodity groups. We found the strongest Chinese control in steel, base metals and battery metals, and steel metals in particular stood out as highly controlled. And this was also not surprising, because iron ore is of vital importance to China's industry and infrastructure development. And long-term planning is especially important for iron ore projects because of the sheer size of the demand and the huge volumes involved in those projects. An interesting finding was that we were only able to confirm Chinese involvement in 3 different rare earth elements projects. And yeah, this was a bit unexpected, considering China's dominant role in the supply chain of rare earths. And we could think of several reasons for this. I mean, it could be that we simply failed to find the information about partnerships, or that plans for partnerships had not been made public. It could also be that many of the rare earth exploration projects, they have not progressed to a stage where Chinese partners would get involved. And then it could also be that Chinese companies, they just prefer to engage in projects elsewhere in the world. Or that Chinese companies, they don't think that it's important to get involved in upstream operations, because they are already in control of the downstream value chain. And then finally, some projects could also be part of genuine attempts at creating these China-free supply chains, even if such supply chains are maybe not so realistic in the short term. So the final slide here. So to what degree do Chinese companies' activities actually align with China's mineral strategy? So we do find that almost all of the Chinese projects, they target those minerals that are on China's official list of strategic minerals. So China has an official list of 24 strategic minerals that was published in 2016. And it was included in the Mineral Resources Plan that was published that year. And there has not been any new list since then, as far as I'm aware. But it should come out, I think, in the next 5-year plan for mineral resources, which I think have been delayed possibly because of the COVID pandemic. So we found that most of the minerals targeted are on that list. For example, many of the metals are on China's list of steel metals, and as I said earlier, one of the projects we examined, and the iron ore projects, were the most tightly controlled ones. So it was a bit surprising that we found so many gold and uranium projects, but gold and uranium are actually on China's list as well, as you can see here. So these are not typically considered critical in the EU, for example, but they are in China. So this does not mean that Chinese companies are being directed by the Chinese state to invest in specific projects, of course, but But it could suggest that the mineral strategy has succeeded in incentivizing companies to secure resources that the Chinese government has decided are strategic for China. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Patrick. Could I invite you to unshare your screen?
Yes.
Then we will have Yang's presentation, where she's zooming in on the current status of those projects, minerals exploration projects in Greenland that involve Chinese companies in some capacity. Over to you.
Thank you. I think Ulrich, Per, and Patrick have all provided very detailed and very comprehensive background and information. So I would just zoom in on the actual Chinese investments or attempted investments in Greenland in mining. I will focus on how they were started, how China got, or Chinese companies got access, what's their progress so far, and maybe if we have time in Q&A, we can talk about the role of private and state actors. This is based on a report, part of our DIIS Defense and Peace and Defense Studies from autumn last year. I will provide the main findings and some updates since then. There are basically 4 mining projects that China has involved itself in. Greenland, up to the north, base metal with zinc and lead, to a little bit down to the east, Wagner Hellø copper project, and then Iswa iron ore mine, and then Canfield. That's the biggest rare earth project so far. China has been involved in some infrastructure projects, but one attempt to buy the Cornedal old naval base was rejected by the Danish government under Lars Løkke Rasmussen at that time. And then China's bid to finance and eventually construct 3 airports were also effectively blocked by the US. So, and now with more sensitivity over critical infrastructure, maybe the chances will be higher in mining, but you will see that maybe it is also difficult in mining. So the 4 projects from the north, the Sitonen base metal project. It started in the early 2010s when an Australian company, Ironbark, asked a Chinese state-owned enterprise, non-ferrous corporation, to help develop this project. So they signed an MOU, and with the prospect that NFC will help acquire funding from major Chinese banks. And if NFC succeeded in acquiring funding from Chinese banks, because SOEs and Chinese banks have good relations, and then they will still need to find 30% of the funding for the project. So in a couple of years, there is not much progress. It seems that NFC and Chinese banks were cautious about the financial prospects of this project, as in the 2010s, the prices of commodities have fallen a lot. But in 2020, a dramatic turn came when the US federal government Export and Import Bank offered to finance this project. So Ironbark applied for a loan from US Exim, and in December last year, US Export and Import Bank provided a letter that point to more than $650 million US, and that is enough to cover all the costs. So if if that loan is successful, then Ironbark will not need any money or cooperation from the Chinese side. So that is the Zhejiang Fjord Zinc lead mine that it has been closest to completion. They have got all the permits, but financing didn't come from the Chinese side. And US seems to be more assertive now and more proactive in coming to the financial, to the infrastructure and mining projects on Greenland. And a little bit down to the north, Wagner copper mine. This mine license was held by a London-based company called Nordic Mining. And it was looking for funding in Australia, didn't succeed, so it went to China for shopping and succeeded in finding a private company called Jiangxi Zhongrun, a private company in Jiangxi province, a big copper producing province in China. And they signed agreement to develop this mine. The Jiangxi provincial government was very happy about this, and it was actually the first license that a Chinese company ever got in Greenland. And sometime later, actually, this private Chinese company formed a mixed ownership enterprise with a provincial level state-owned enterprise, Jiangxi Copper, even though Jiangxi Copper is one of Fortune 500 and one of the biggest copper companies in the world. So this joint, this mixed ownership company would invest and develop this mine. But the same story goes that it seems the Jiangxi province and the state-owned enterprises have become more careful about the profits of company and not just market share and grab upstream resources. So not much has happened, and the license expired in 2019. So the license has gone to another Australian company. Further down south, Iswa iron ore mine. The license was held by a company called London Mining. London Mining had operations also in Africa, but was affected by Ebola pandemic, and it was going bankrupt in 2015. So a Chinese private company saw the opportunity to buy cheap assets and bought London Mining's Greenland branch and obtained the license. General DIIS is also the same company that wanted to buy the Cornwall naval base. And in general, people here are very suspicious of its connection, but we're never sure if it has any connection to the Chinese government or public sector. But this company, you know, with a lot of operations in coal mining in China and real estate, has come into serious financial trouble. And actually, the company and its management have been put on a list of the Chinese government of dishonest people. So that means the Chinese government thinks that they have the ability to pay its debt, but it doesn't do so. So they're faced with a lot of financial restrictions with China about their further investment or moving their assets overseas. And because nothing happens with this project, the license was withdrawn by the Greenlandic government in November last year. So that project gone too. And the last one, that is also the most controversial and significant, is the Canfield rare earth mine. It was also very close to completion. The license has been held by an Australian company, Greenland Minerals and Energy, and it's sort of with the help of Greenlandic government, embassy in China, Chinese Ministry of Land and Resources, they found a partner in a Chinese company called Shenghe. Shenghe is a mixed ownership company with majority as state-owned. And it was a relatively small player in China's rare earth sector. And in 2015, when, you know, since 2012, Chinese government has been regulating the rare earth production in China because of pollution concerns and because they want to control the capacity of production. So they may have more influence on the global rare earth market and also to control over capacity. So this company, Shenghe, it was not part of the 6 big groups that received quota in 2015. Then we saw that in 2016, it signed several international agreements to seek either exploration or import or other forms of cooperation. And this project in Greenland is its major overseas activity, as it obtained 12.5% shareholding in the Australian company GM, but currently it has less than 10%. The Australian company has worked hard to maintain environmental assessment approval and social impact approval, and was going to public hearing phase. But as we know, in the general election last year in April in Greenland, the opposition party IA was campaigning heavily on the concerns of some local communities near this mine about potential pollution from a byproduct, uranium, and maybe also thorium of the radioactive activity on farming, on fishing. So the newly elected government made a law in November to ban uranium mining and exploration, and that effectively blocked the further progress of this Canfield mine. Currently, the Australian company is requesting arbitration from the Greenlandic government and from the Danish government. So, in conclusion, you can see out of these 4 mining projects, basically nothing is left. Either 2 of them didn't have any progress because Chinese companies and banks have been careful, and one of them was lucky to get financing from a more assertive US and from the US government bank, and the last one was blocked by because of environmental concerns. So the future looks very uncertain for Chinese investments in Greenland. It's also consistent with the recent developments in Chinese, domestic economy, that you need to be careful about the financial returns, about the environmental impacts in the overseas projects. So I would presume that Chinese companies will be more careful about investing in Greenland again. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Yang, for this overview. Remember that you can write your questions in the Q&A box, and we'll tend to them as soon as Patrick has invited us into his PhD work, also where he's been focusing on the different priorities and linguistic categories involved in how the Chinese state prioritizes its foreign policy and minerals interests, and particularly how private and state-owned companies maneuver these categories, and that's where this work comes out of. Well, Patrick will tell us about what happens when the language games involved in this may backfire. Please.
Yes, so I will share my screen again. Yeah, can you see my slides? Great. Okay, so I'd like to start from the observation that Arctic countries, they increasingly look at Chinese investments in the Arctic as security threats. And this has been especially apparent in Greenland. It's one of the reasons why the US is becoming more engaged in the country as a response to an increase in Chinese activities in the past, even though, as Yang said, it seems to be on withdrawing now a little bit. So the US reopened its consulate in Greenland in 2020, and it had been closed for several decades. So of course, there can be many reasons for thinking about Chinese engagement in the Arctic as a security challenge. And yeah, so as I mentioned in my first presentation, there's the idea of a China Inc. Coordinated Chinese strategy for advancing Chinese state objectives in the Arctic. And part of this is the concern that Chinese companies, they act not only as profit-driven companies, but also to advance the political objectives of the CCP. And then that their investments come with a kind of hidden geopolitical agenda. Here, I will not really engage with the debate about whether there's a real threat or not. So that's not what I will do. Instead, I want to highlight some of the underlying factors that I believe have contributed to the perception of a more coordinated Chinese approach in the Arctic. What I will talk about is political framing in the Chinese political context. So how Chinese companies talk about and frame their projects in China in company reports and other external communication that is meant for a Chinese audience. And then the misunderstandings, or at least the partial misunderstandings that this framing can lead to when it's picked up in Western countries and read by a Western audience which is not the intended audience. And this talk is based on one of the articles of my PhD thesis, which I wrote with one of my former PhD supervisors, Jesper Soiten. So first, what do I mean by political framing in the Chinese context? So when Chinese companies invest overseas, especially state-owned enterprises, they often need to justify what they do politically. And for some companies, it may be more about paying lip service than anything else. So when they talk about what they do overseas, they need to at least name drop the key policies and political slogans that are important at the moment. But for others, it's a chance to add political priority to their projects. Chinese capital outflow is getting more tightly controlled now, as Yang mentioned. And so there's more competition between companies for state funding. To receive funding from state banks, you usually need to have a solid business case. The project has to make money, of course. But it can also be helpful if you can show that your project contributes to state objectives. If you can argue that the project is crucial for advancing the Belt and Road Initiative, for example, it could be easier to get funding. I think that BRI in particular has opened up some opportunities to get funding for projects for more marginal projects in regions of the world that the Chinese state thinks are strategic to China. But this framing that Chinese companies use domestically in China to attract support and political support and funding from the Chinese state, it can backfire when it's read by others than the intended audience. So I'm going to give examples from a specific case to illustrate this problematic. And I will also show how this affects how Western companies frame their Chinese partners. Because one of the results of the Chinese framing is that the involvement of Chinese partners becomes more sensitive. So Western companies also need to adjust to this in their framing, in their own framing. So I will focus on the Canfield project. So Yang has already introduced you to the basic situation around this project. But just to briefly refresh your memory, so it's owned by this Australian company, Greenland Minerals Limited, and Zhonghe Resources is the Chinese company that has invested in this project. And it's not one of the largest rare earth players, so it's one of the 4 big It used to be 6, now there's 4 actually that have quotas. So it's not one of those, but it has access to quotas through partnerships with some of those. And it's also one of the most active Chinese rare earth companies overseas. And Shenghe took 12.5% shareholding in GML in 2016. So what Jesper and I studied in our paper was how the Chinese and Australian companies, how they frame the Canfield project to their respective target audiences. And we did so by collecting and analyzing company documents, and this included annual reports, press releases, and company presentations. So I will summarize some of our findings. So to begin with, Shenghe. In annual reports and other Chinese language external communication, Shenghe, it frames its overseas investment as supporting China's raw material strategy on the one hand, and its industrial policy, but also the company's own development needs. And it references Made in China 2025, which is a controversial Chinese industrial policy, and also the policy for developing strategic emerging industries. And in Western countries, these policies are quite controversial. They are very ambitious plans, which, if they were successful, it would basically mean that China would dominate most high-tech sectors, and often at the expense of the countries that are currently leading. And another concern is that the strong government support that Chinese firms get from policies like Made in China 2025, that it gives them an unfair competitive advantage. And then on the foreign policy side, Shenghe makes references to the BRI. For example, Shenghe presents itself as a practitioner of the Belt and Road Initiative in some of its reports and also on its website. So some Western politicians, they are very suspicious about these policies, in particular, I think the BRI and Made in China 2025. But they are actually very much part of the standard political rhetoric in China. And as I mentioned at the beginning, they are such an integral part of political discourse in China that it's almost difficult for the companies to avoid them. So at the Chinese domestic level, this type of framing is very common. Here's a nice example of how some political rhetoric is intended for a specific Chinese audience. So this is a comparison of the message from the chairman on Shenghe's company website. And in the Chinese version, it includes this formulation to be a practitioner of the Belt and Road Initiative. But in the English language version, then this formulation is missing, but the text seems to be almost identical or very, nearly identical in other ways. So it seems to just have been lifted out intentionally. And I think the most likely reason is that Shenghe decided that this formulation looks bad to Western audiences. So how is the Canfield project framed to international investors? So as the owner of the project, GML makes most of the presentations to international audiences, and they'd like to highlight their Chinese partners' world-class processing technology and their global customer network. And we also see that previous reports, annual reports, they had these discussions of domestic policies in China, policies for the rare earth sector. And the aim of those discussions seemed to have been to show that the project will benefit from developments in the Chinese rare earth industry, and also that the project has official support in China. But these discussions are absent in the later reports. So why is that? It could be because framing the project to international investors as enjoying political backing in China it's becoming more politically problematic. And this also has to do a bit with Chinese actions, because Chinese state media has become, I think this was a couple of years ago now, but there was during the US-China trade war, then state media became more vocal about China weaponizing its control over rare earth supply chains. And then if you were to present your project as helping to meet Western demand for rare earths, then but you rely on a Chinese partner for processing in China, then it's probably not good to have Chinese state media discussing how China should weaponize rare earths. And we see now when the project has moved into the marketing phase, then there's more focus on how the project will, how GML wants to work with European industry and benefit European industry. And I think it's interesting to compare with another rare earth exploration project in Greenland, the Tanbreeze project, because the owner of that project seems to be promoting that project as not requiring Chinese involvement. So you can see how Chinese involvement can be framed as both an advantage, but also can be viewed as problematic in some cases. And this graph here shows how the number of mentions of China and Chinese and Shenghe has decreased in GML's annual reports. Of course, we cannot say for sure that this is part of a strategy to play down Chinese involvement in their project or not. But it's possible, considering that policymakers now they talk more and more about the need to establish China-free supply chains. And also we see that some companies, they promote themselves as contributing to such China-free supply chains. So now let's look at Western reactions to this framing and then the Chinese response. So a consequence of this sort of self-promotion by Chinese companies as helping to carry out state objectives is that the Chinese approach can appear more centrally coordinated and state controlled than it is. And these images can then be used to securitize Chinese investments in the Arctic. So let's look at another example here quickly. So here the Chinese company Shandong Gold wanted to acquire a gold mine in the Canadian Arctic, but their bid was rejected by the Canadian government on national security grounds. I mean, like many other companies, Shandong Gold has talked about their overseas projects as supporting the BRI. And some of those who some of those in Canada who opposed the acquisition, they raised concerns that this project could help China get a foothold in the Arctic for its Polar Silk Road. And of course, there may be a lot of reasons for why Canada rejected the Chinese bid. So this was during the hostage diplomacy crisis between Canada and China. So relations were really poor, and they're still very poor. But I think the idea that the company was interested in the project not only for the resource but also for geopolitical ambitions that also contributed. And I think it's interesting to note here also that gold is actually classified as a strategic resource in China. So it's not typically considered critical or strategic in the West, but it is in China. So if we're interested in the factors that may have had an impact, I mean, apart from the purely commercial interest of the company, if we're interested in what other factors could have contributed, then apart from the project's strategic location for the BRI, then state interest in gold might also have played a role as well. So how have Chinese policymakers responded? So Chinese leaders are of course aware of how China's policies are being perceived abroad, and they have made some efforts to try to reshape the global narrative surrounding them. And I will just give a few examples here. So in 2015, a Chinese official document came out that established that the Chinese name for the BRI should be the Chinese name, sorry, for One Belt, One Road, so DIIS, it should be translated officially as Belt and Road Initiative, or the BRI. So the word one in One Belt, One Road was considered inappropriate for describing the global scope of the project. And then I think one also sounds a bit exclusionary, like it's only one road and one belt. So they wanted to get rid of that. But it kept its original name in Chinese, so it's only affected the English translation. And the document also established that the term initiative should be used, so not strategy, agenda, project, or program, or something like that. Especially not the term strategy, because strategy implies a coordinated and ordered plan of action, and it's more likely to raise concern in Western countries. And then references to Made in China 2025 have also been toned down following criticism from Western countries. And this seems to have affected the framing strategies of Chinese companies as well. So we saw that Zhonghe used to make references to Made in China 2025 in his annual reports, but they have not done that in the 3 most recent annual reports, I think. Yeah, let me just go to the last slide here. So where will this all lead? So when Chinese engagement in the Arctic becomes securitized in the West, the issue also becomes more sensitive in China. So it might result in Chinese investors pulling out because of this increased sensitivity that is attached to Chinese activities. And as far as I know, there are no Chinese investment plans in Greenland at the moment. And I think we see signs that China will take a more cautious approach in the Arctic. But then, of course, the COVID pandemic might also have played a part here as well. So I guess we will wait and see. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, Patrick. And you're on sharing as well. So I hope that you are now able to see all the panelists. I have a handful of good questions from the audience that I'll pass on in good order, but I think we can still answer a couple of more questions if they are burning. So please add them to the Q&A sector. I think I'd like to begin with a very specific question from that turns on this new regulation that and I think I'll direct the question to Per. This new regulation, this new law that the Greenlandic Parliament passed in principle to regulate against uranium exploration and uranium extraction, but in the concrete occasion was, of course, the Guanajuato project that is now so in the legal battlefield. But the question concerns this law that was passed apart from the Guanajuato project. Will that affect other ongoing or in progress mining activities in Greenland, or is stuff just continuing as it used to before the law, except from the Guanajuato project? Please.
Thank you very much. Yes, that's a good question. We have tried to discuss it among colleagues as well, because the law says 100 parts per million. That means 100 gram per ton uranium, and it related both to mineral exploration and to mining operation. And there are some, I don't know how many, but there are a couple of uranium exploration projects. And of course, they they're out. But the uranium sometimes occur as well as a minor element or trace element to other mineralizations, and there may be some type of mineralizations where we could have, say, more than 100 parts per million uranium. So that's one part of it. So the other one is actually more this psychological aspect. What does it mean for the investment climate if you change regulations on existing licenses? And I think we have to see if that will, say, give any response.
Thank you. And if the questioner thinks something is left in question, please repeat or detail in the Q&A box. First, I'll direct a question to Yang. There's a question: can you expand upon why the US and Denmark reacted differently to Chinese investments in the airport and the old naval station, contrasted to investments in mining and other types of projects? What's your impression on that?
Yeah, I think it's very interesting. And in the past, mining seems not sensitive at all, but it seems that it has gained attention, especially from the US. Whatever economic activities China is expanding in Greenland, in the Arctic, the US is paying attention. But on a distinction between infrastructure and mining, maybe the people working in the defense sector, those working in intelligence and military, can provide the best answer. But from what I read, for example, if China has gained access or bought or rented a naval base, then the US may be afraid that China can plot some military facilities that can get information, or it's easier for China to get information about China's Tula airbase there. And also there have been arguments about these airports, that if China is involved in the construction of the airport, then maybe China may plant some eavesdropping facilities to listen to or to steal critical information. And as we've seen in Denmark's new law on screening foreign investment in critical infrastructure, it doesn't cover Greenland and Faroe Islands. But one assumption in there is that if a foreign investor, especially those connected to foreign governments, if they have control or if they have a backdoor to critical infrastructure, they may stop the functioning of that infrastructure and lead to the paralysis of national economic systems, or have a bad attack on, for example, nuclear power, and that would be disastrous. And that's the reason you can see a wave of new lawmaking in Western capitals to strengthen screening of foreign investment.
Thank you. I might take the chance to add that maybe the implications of the question is that there is a difference in Danish and US reactions, saying that the US and Denmark has stepped in to avoid infrastructure investments, but has not in the same way stepped in to avoid Chinese mining investments. But perhaps one of the reasons might have been that we haven't been that close to realization of a major mining project, except perhaps the Citronenfjord one, where the US, in a sense, did step in with a bank guarantee to try to crowd out Chinese investors. The Guanajuato project, the Americans and the Danes didn't have to step in because the Greenlandic people, in a sense, in an election stepped in, not because of Chinese influence, but because of uranium. So we don't know really, perhaps, whether US and Denmark would intervene if one of these mining projects work really close to realizations with Chinese involvement. I have another question that I'd like to direct to Per and or Patrick, because it says here that many shareholders of mining companies in the Arctic do not see China's even government involvement as a negative aspect. On the contrary, solid Chinese engagement is seen as an assurance, a savior of the investment, because as Pierre was pointing to the risk of supply chain disruption. So could you elaborate, Pierre and Patrick, a bit on this perspective on Chinese investments? On the one hand, Pierre tells us that in a lot of commodities we need Chinese companies downstream the supply chain. On the other hand, Patrick tells us that that there might be troubles advertising that need and that connection too much. Could you elaborate a bit on what's most important, or what are the dilemmas for the companies involved?
Can I start maybe by clarify a little bit then? Yeah, so I mean, I think as we argue in the policy brief that is just online now before the seminar, China is Western companies are reliant on access to Chinese supply chains for processing, right? So so it's a bit of a they need to. I mean, they have a lot to gain from showing investors, of course, that they have access to Chinese market and the Chinese supply chain, and also, of course, in many cases, when it's difficult to find funding, then you might still be able to find funding in China. They have sometimes more money also, and I think that. And they also have the technological expertise downstream for processing, as I mentioned. But I think that it's becoming a bit more politically problematic because of the trade war, and when you have the Chinese state media making these kind of veiled threats that China will weaponize its control over the rare earth supply chain, then that makes it a little bit more problematic. So I guess it's a little bit about how you, a bit like a double-edged sword, that you need to show to your investors that you have access to these Chinese supply chains, but then you also don't want to come off as too reliant on China when the relationship between many Western countries and China is becoming worse. Yeah, I don't know if Pierre, you can add maybe something.
Yes, thank you very much. First of all, I'll say that for some of the mineral exploration projects, we can see that they, now I'm talking about the rare earth projects, that they are, say, on their websites, they claim that they are non-Chinese, they are free of this, they are supporting the Western and part of the new Western supply chain for rare earths. But if you dig a little bit and wait some months or maybe a couple of years, you can see that they actually have engaged themselves with a Chinese group. And I find it's a natural thing, because what are actually the options here? There are no options. So if they want to do mining on rare earths, they have to go to China, because the supply chain processing all of this in the West does not exist. And I think it's not only relevant for the rare earths, it's relevant for many of the other elements as well.
Yeah, can I push you just a little bit on this? Because on the one hand, I understand from your presentation, also what I've learned from you earlier, that rare earth, that's a lot of, it ends up being a lot of different things, but usually or often starts out as a very complex piece of rock. So this claim you have that there is no alternative to a Chinese supply chain, does that go for all of the REs, or is there some point down the line where this rock has been disassembled so much that you can actually do the rest, or do the most important part, or do something without China? Or is it basically you need to go through China when you have you want a rare earth?
Yeah, Brian, I think we have to distinguish here. What do we have the capability to separate? Because you're right, we're talking about 17 individual elements sitting in the same mineral, and that's what we call the rare earth. But in order to use it in the industry, we have to separate it, and to work on these, make them into metals, make them into alloys, etc., in order to distribute it to the various types of industries and purposes. So it's not because we don't have the know-how, but the infrastructure, the industrial infrastructure is not in place. And that's the next point I mentioned as well, that it will come in place only if a business concept, attractive business concept, can be established. Well, that nothing will happen, because we can't do as they do in China. They can just decide and do. We have to have incentives, economic incentives, in order to develop the industry.
Thank you. I will dig down and take another question, which I think I will have to discuss a bit with the question before I pass it on, because the question says, could the increase in Chinese investment be seen as an increase in competition that might increase the leverage that local governments, such as the Greenlandic one, has in negotiating deals with mining companies? And so, first thing is the starting point of the question is that there is an increase in Chinese investments. We don't know that from the presentations here, but we got the impression from Patrick's first presentation that there isn't a lot of Chinese investments, but nevertheless, Chinese investments exist as an alternative, or an imagined alternative to other investments in the mining sector. So, perhaps Pierre again is the one I should ask. The fact that there is an idea, or is real Chinese investments possible in the mineral sector in the Arctic, do you, when you look at the overall image of how which mineral projects, how they proceed, does it work to give the impression that the local governments, local authorities, local communities maybe even have more leverage in their negotiations because they can point to this alternative investment than if they would have to rely on Western investments? Do you see that dynamic?
I'm not sure really. I haven't say thought about it. But what we see is that when China offers say investments, that's say very much technical assistance. It's investment in the for the capital cost, and of course it comes with a cost, and the cost is offtake agreement. So and in the West, I think we don't work that way. So and the Western investors, I mean the big investors, the special banks for investment in mining projects, they don't work that way, and they work, say, on offtake agreements and security for what's in the ground, and feasibility studies and all this. So I think we may have as well to distinguish between where we are in the stage of the development of the mine, that the first many years, the small companies doing exploration, they need say investments actually to keep the process running and to keep the shares up. And later on, we are talking about another scale of investments, and that's, say, when China comes in, but say, what type of say, what's that called, reflection or thoughts it creates around in the government system, I have no clue.
But an important takeaway is that we need to perhaps distinguish the lottery phase of minerals exploration, where you basically invest in a lottery coupon to say whether something come out of it, and then the latter phase where you actually produce stuff, and that's a whole different.
Exactly.
I think I can maybe two questions relate to you. The first one piggybacks on Yang's remark that even in Greenland there was a differentiation. There were both state-owned companies, Chinese companies involved at some stage, and then really not state-owned companies. Do you have, Per and Patrick, from your wider Arctic picture, you didn't mention whether you found a lot of state-owned companies or you mainly found private or more marginally state-owned companies in particular in Canada?
I think Patrick is the best position to distinguish between the various Chinese groups.
Yeah, I think that one thing we noticed was that most of the companies are there are many state-owned companies, of course, and some of the largest ones are active there. The public or private companies engaging are also large companies, and large public companies in China, they also have state links on to different degrees. For example, if you're a public company in China now, I think since a few years back, you are required to have a party cell in the company. So I mean, there are varying degrees of links to the state. Of course, that doesn't mean that the Chinese government knows or controls everything that happens everywhere. But we didn't find, you know, like in other places of the world, for example, in Africa, there have researchers have found the small scale miners to be active, but we haven't found them in the Arctic, really. It could be, I guess, because the Arctic investments, they generally require to projects in the Arctic, they require bigger investments, and they can also be technologically and logistically demanding. So that's why we see this that the companies engaging are usually larger companies.
Thank you very much. I have one question which I really wished we could answer, but I don't think we're in a capacity to it, because it concerns whether Chinese investments in the Arctic mining are moving from North America and Scandinavia into Russia, but we didn't really cover that in our research. So hopefully we'll be able to go back to that question in a couple of years when we have had someone digging down in Russian regulation and permits and investments. And we have another question concerning what parts of the melting ice, what kind of the maritime traffic allowed that will help mining most, but I down prioritize that question because I don't think we have any expertise on that here either. So all that's left is to say thank you very much for the very good questions. Thank you very much for the presentation and your answers. The dear audience, stay tuned. There is a couple of publications that's been advertised in the chat, but soon Per and Patrick's working paper with more numbers on actual Chinese engagement in Arctic minerals projects will be out. And we'll be back with more on Arctic affairs and Chinese affairs and minerals for the green transition. Thank you very much.